June 6th, 1944, 6:25 a.m., Gold Beach, Normandy. The ramp dropped and Sergeant James Fletcher braced for the hurricane of bullets that had torn apart so many other landing craft that morning. But instead of machine gun fire, he heard something else, a deep, mechanical roar that made the steel deck beneath his boots vibrate. Through the spray and smoke, he saw it, a Sherman tank, but not like any Sherman he'd ever seen. This one was wrapped in a canvas skirt that billowed and rippled in the waves. It was floating, a 30-ton steel box somehow bobbing in the surf like a cork, its tracks churning water instead of mud. Jesus Christ, Fletcher breathed. It's swimming. The DD tank, duplex drive they called it, wallowed past the landing craft, its hull riding low in the choppy water. Canvas flotation screens kept it afloat, barely. Propellers mounted at the rear pushed it forward at a crawling 4 miles per hour. It looked absurd, impossible, like something a child might draw after being told tanks couldn't swim, but it was real, and it was heading for the beach ahead of the infantry. On the beach, German machine gunners in concrete bunkers tracked the strange shape approaching through the dawn mist. They'd expected landing craft, expected infantry. They hadn't expected swimming tanks. By the time they opened fire, 3 DD tanks had already dropped their canvas screens and were rumbling up the beach, their 75mm guns rotating toward the pillboxes. Fletcher hit the sand 30 seconds later, following in the wake of those impossible machines. Where other beaches, Omaha especially, had become slaughterhouses, Gold Beach was different. The swimming tanks had arrived first. They'd suppressed the German guns. They'd given the infantry precious seconds of cover, and they'd done it because one man, dismissed as crazy by half the British Army, had insisted that tanks could swim 3 years earlier. In 1941, a garden in Surrey, England, Major General Percy Hobart knelt in his vegetable patch, pulling weeds with methodical precision. At 60 years old, with his military career apparently over, he'd found a new enemy to fight, dandelions. The letter from the War Office sat on the garden table, still folded. Hobart already knew what it would say, the same thing every letter from the Army had said for the past year. Thank you for your suggestions, but we see no practical application at this time. He'd proposed modifying tanks to handle specific battlefield problems. Tanks that could clear mines, tanks that could lay bridges, tanks that could float. Each idea had been received with polite skepticism by generals who preferred traditional armor tactics. More of Percy's mad schemes, one staff officer had reportedly said, but Hobart wasn't mad. He was simply thinking about problems no one else wanted to consider. He'd spent his career in the Royal Tank Corps, watching armor evolve from the lumbering monsters of World War I into the fast, powerful machines now rolling across Europe in Hitler's blitzkrieg. He understood tanks better than most. Men, their potential and their limitations, and he understood that the next great amphibious invasion, whenever and wherever it came, would fail unless someone solved the specific problems of getting armor ashore and inland against fortified positions. The British Army, it seemed, would prefer not to think about such problems until they became disasters. His wife appeared at the garden door. "Percy, there's someone here to see you." Hobart stood, brushing dirt from his hands, expecting perhaps the vicar or a neighbor. Instead, he found himself facing a staff car and a familiar rotund figure climbing out with considerable effort. Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister walked across the lawn, cigar clamped between his teeth, ignoring the garden path entirely. "Hobart, they tell me you're growing vegetables." "Someone must, Prime Minister. The U-boats are making food scarce." Yes. Churchill waved his cigar dismissively. "I need you to stop growing vegetables and start building strange tanks." Hobart blinked. "Sir? Strange tanks?" Churchill repeated. "Odd ones. Peculiar ones. Tanks that do things tanks aren't supposed to do." He fixed Hobart with an intense stare. "I've read your proposals. The swimming tanks. The mine-clearing tanks. The bridge-laying contraptions. The Army thinks you're mad. I'm aware, sir." "Good, because I need someone mad enough to turn those ideas into reality." Churchill puffed his cigar. "We're going to invade France, Hobart. Not tomorrow, not next month, but eventually. And when we do, we're going to need every mad invention you can dream up. Otherwise, the beaches will run red with British blood." He gestured with his cigar toward the house. "Pack your things. You're going back to active duty. I'm giving you a command, the 79th Armored Division. Your mission is to design, build, and train crews for every peculiar tank modification you've ever imagined." Hobart felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Purpose. "How much time do I have?" Churchill smiled grimly. "Not enough. But then, we never do we?" September 1941. Tank Proving Grounds, Southern England. The Royal Engineers watching the demonstration were skeptical. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Graham stood with his arms crossed, watching a modified Churchill tank approach. A wall of concertina wire. "This is the armored." "Vehicle Royal Engineers?" explained Major Hobart recently. promoted and now in charge of the 79th Armored Division's development program. And we call it the AVRE. It carries a 290mm petard mortar for destroying fortifications and can launch various attachments, such as, Graham asked. Such as this, Hobart signaled. The AVRE stopped, and a wooden bridge began to unfold from its front, a great articulated contraption called a small box girder bridge. In less than a minute, the bridge extended across a 10-foot gap, strong enough to support a tank. Interesting, Graham admitted. But why mount it on a tank? Because bridges are needed where bridges don't exist, Hobart replied. Under fire, while advancing. A regular bridge-laying unit would be slaughtered trying to construct something in the middle of a battlefield. But a tank can survive long enough to place the bridge, then move on. He walked toward the AVRE, patting its armored flank. This tank can also carry fascines, bundles of wood that can be dropped into ditches to fill them. It can tow rollers to detonate mines. It can lay trackway across soft sand. We're designing it to solve every obstacle an advancing tank might encounter. And the petard mortar? Hobart smiled. For the bunkers, the demonstration continued. The AVRE fired its petard, a massive 40-pound bomb called a flying dustbin, because of its shape and trajectory. The projectile arced lazily through the air and struck a concrete mock-up of a German pillbox. The explosion was tremendous. When the smoke cleared, the pillbox was rubble. Graham whistled softly. I take it back. Your tanks aren't mad. They're bloody brilliant. Tell that to the skeptics, Hobart muttered. I've got 3 different committees questioning every design decision. But slowly, surely, the skeptics were being won over, not by arguments, but by demonstrations. Hobart's philosophy was simple. Build it, show it working, force them to acknowledge reality. December 1942, experimental tank facility. The Sherman DD tank looked like someone had tried to gift wrap a tank for Christmas and failed spectacularly. Canvas screens surrounded the hull, held up by inflatable rubber tubes. At the rear, 2 propellers were mounted on awkward-looking struts. It floats? Asked General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed to command the 21st Army Group. It floats, Hobart confirmed. The canvas screen provides buoyancy. The propellers provide propulsion. A crew of 5 can launch it from a landing craft 2 miles offshore and drive it to the beach. Montgomery walked around the tank, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He was known as a meticulous planner, a general who left nothing to chance. What's the failure rate? In calm seas, less than 5%. In rough seas, Hobart hesitated. Higher. How much higher? Oh, unacceptable losses if the waves exceed 2 feet. Montgomery nodded. Then we'll pray for calm seas. But we'll use them. On D-Day, the infantry needs covering fire from the moment they hit the beach. These swimming tanks, however absurd they look, will give us that. He turned to Hobart. Well, what else have you got? Hobart smiled. This was why Churchill had brought him back. Not because his ideas were conventional, but because they solved problems conventional thinking ignored. Come with me, he said. I want to show you the crab. The Sherman crab was even stranger than the DD tank. A rotating drum was mounted on the front, studded with chains that flailed the ground like a medieval weapon. As the drum spun, the chains beat the earth with tremendous force, hard enough to detonate buried mines. A mine-clearing tank, Hobart explained as the crab demonstrated on a test field seeded with practice mines. Each detonation sent up a geyser of dirt. It clears a path 10 feet wide. Tanks following behind can advance safely. Montgomery watched the crab work its way across the field, chains thrashing. And the crew survives the mine detonations? The chains detonate mines several feet ahead of the tank. The explosion is directed upward, away from the vehicle. We've tested it extensively. The crew hears the blasts, feels the concussion, but the armor protects them. Losses? Lower than trying to clear mines by hand. Much lower. Montgomery made notes in a small leather book he carried. I want 200 of these. Can you deliver by June? June? Hobart calculated rapidly. If I had the production priority, the crews, the training time, you'll have whatever you need. Montgomery interrupted. The Prime Minister has made it clear. Percy Hobart gets what Percy Hobart asks for, within reason. Then, yes, June. They walked back toward the command building, past rows of modified tanks in various stages of development. Each one looked bizarre, like something designed by a committee of engineers who'd never seen a tank before, but each one solved a problem. And on the beaches of Normandy, problems would be solved with steel and ingenuity or blood and failure. Montgomery paused at the door. The Americans are skeptical of your designs. I know. General Bradley thinks swimming tanks are a waste of resources. Hobart said nothing. The Americans had their own doctrines, their own ideas about armor tactics. If they wanted to land conventional tanks from landing craft under heavy fire, that was their decision. Prove them wrong, Montgomery said. On D-Day, prove all the skeptics wrong. March 1943, 79th Armored Division Headquarters, England. Captained. Robert Ling stared at the technical drawings spread across his desk and wondered if he'd been assigned to a unit commanded by a lunatic. The drawing showed a Churchill tank modified to carry what looked like a giant bobbin of canvas on its nose. According to the specifications, the tank would unroll this carpet across soft sand or mud, creating an instant roadway for vehicles to follow. "It's called a bobbin," said Major Hobart, appearing at Ling's shoulder. "Or an ark if it's carrying the bridge variant. The men have started calling them all Hobart's Funnies. Sir, with respect, you think it's ridiculous. I think it's..." Ling searched for diplomatic words. "Unconventional, sir." Hobart pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. At 62, he was older than most division commanders, and the pace of development work was exhausting, but he couldn't afford to slow down. "Tell me, Captain, have you ever seen a tank bog down in soft sand?" "Yes, sir. Tunisia. Watched a whole column get stuck." "And what happened?" "The engineers laid steel matting. Took 4 hours. German artillery found us, and, well, we lost most of the column." Hobart tapped the drawing. "This tank carries its own matting, unrolls it as it advances. Takes 2 minutes instead of 4 hours. The tanks behind it can keep moving instead of becoming stationary targets." Ling looked at the drawing with new eyes. It still looked absurd, but the absurdity had purpose. "The Germans will have the beaches covered with obstacles," Hobart continued. "Mines, ditches, concrete barriers, wire. Every type of fortification their engineers can devise. We need specialized equipment to overcome each obstacle quickly. Because on D-Day, time will be measured in lives. Every minute we're pinned on those beaches, men die." He stood, joints creaking. "I don't care if my tanks look funny, Captain. I care if they work. Now I need you to coordinate with the Royal Engineers on the bobbin trials. We're testing the first prototype next week." The proving grounds had become a bizarre museum of military innovation. In one corner, a Sherman crab thrashed its mine-flailing chains against the ground. In another, a Churchill Avrier prepared to launch a fascine, a massive bundle of wooden logs, into a mock anti-tank ditch. Near the water tank, a D.D. Sherman bobbed awkwardly while engineers adjusted its flotation screens. Sergeant William Harris, transferred from a conventional tank regiment, walked through this mechanical circus with growing bewilderment. "That one's the Crocodile," his new commander, Lieutenant Peter Wells, explained, pointing to a Churchill tank towing an armored trailer. "Flamethrower. The trailer carries fuel, range of about 120 yards when the wind's right." Jesus. Harris had seen German flamethrowers in North Africa. Terrifying weapons, but the operator was vulnerable. "And the trailer? Armored, detachable if it gets hit. The tank can survive, even if the fuel explodes." They walked past a Valentine tank modified with enormous wooden rollers on its front. "That's a snake," Wells said. "Tows a pipe filled with explosives. Lay it across a minefield, detonate it, clear a path." "And does it work?" "Sometimes. We're still refining it." Harris absorbed all this in silence. He'd volunteered for the 79th, expecting a normal tank division. Instead, he'd landed in what seemed like a mad scientist's laboratory. "I know what you're thinking," Wells said. "I thought the same thing when I arrived. These tanks look like carnival attractions." "Sir, but I've been here 6 months now, watched them develop, watched them being tested, and I've come to realize something." Wells stopped and turned to face Harris. "General Hobart isn't mad. He's the only sane one among us." "Sir, everyone else is planning to land tanks on heavily defended beaches using conventional methods. Send them ashore from landing craft, straight into German fire. Hope they get off the beach before being destroyed." Wells shook his head. "That's insane. Hobart's trying to give those tanks a fighting chance." April 1943. Combined Operations Headquarters. The briefing room was filled with officers from every branch of the Allied forces planning the invasion. American generals sat alongside British. Royal Navy officers conferred with RAF squadron leaders. Everyone knew they were planning the largest amphibious operation in history. General Hobart stood before a large map of the French coast, pointer in hand. "The German defenses are extensive," he began. "Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests protected by minefields, anti-tank ditches, beach obstacles designed to destroy landing craft. And behind all of this, Rommel is building his Atlantic wall stronger every day." He moved the pointer along the beach. "A conventional assault will fail or succeed at catastrophic cost. The infantry will be pinned down. The tanks will be destroyed or stranded. We need specialized equipment." An American colonel, Harris didn't catch the name, raised his hand. "General, we've reviewed your proposals. Swimming tanks, mine-clearing tanks, bridge layers. With respect, these seem overly complicated. Why not simply land more conventional tanks?" "Because conventional tanks will be destroyed before they clear the beach," Hobart replied bluntly. "The DD tanks can provide covering fire from the moment infantry hits the sand. The crabs can clear safe paths through minefields. The AVREs can destroy bunkers and fill ditches. Each specialized vehicle multiplies the effectiveness of the assault." "Oh, or creates new points of failure," the American countered. Complex equipment breaks down. Your swimming tanks? What happens if the seas are rough? Then we'll have problems, Hobart admitted. But we'll have worse problems trying to land. Conventional tanks under direct fire from prepared positions. But the debate continued for another hour. The British, having seen Hobart's demonstrations, were largely convinced. The Americans remained skeptical. They had their own armor doctrines, their own ideas about tank warfare. Finally, General Montgomery intervened. Gentlemen, the British and Canadian forces will use the specialized armor. The American forces will use their standard procedures. D-Day will tell us who was right. After the meeting, Hobart found himself walking with Montgomery through the headquarters garden. The Americans think I'm wasting resources, Hobart said quietly. The Americans haven't fought in Europe yet, Montgomery replied. They will learn, perhaps the hard way. I hope not. Montgomery paused to light a cigarette. Your funnies, as the men call them, will they be ready? We're producing as fast as possible. Training crews, developing tactics, but there's never enough time. There never is. Montgomery exhaled smoke into the spring air. But you'll do your best. That's all anyone can ask. May 1943. Tank training grounds. The crews selected for the 79th Armored Division were volunteers, men willing to learn new skills, new tactics, new ways of using armor. They came from destroyed tank regiments, from training battalions, from infantry units looking for a different role. Trooper David Mitchell had survived the disaster at Dieppe in 1942, where Canadian forces had been slaughtered on the beaches. He'd watched tanks get stuck in the shingle, Sunnygill, unable to advance, becoming stationary targets for German anti-tank guns. Now he was training to operate a Sherman Crab, and the logic of Hobart's designs suddenly made perfect sense. The chains will detonate mines ahead of you, the instructor explained. Your job is to advance steadily, maintain spacing from other crabs, and clear a path exactly where the infantry needs it. Not faster, not slower. Steady. Mitchell sat in the driver's position, hands on the controls, feeling the tank vibrate as the flail chains spun. Through this vision port, he could see the chains beating the ground in a controlled frenzy. Each mine detonation felt like a punch to the hull. The noise was tremendous, a constant metallic screaming mixed with explosions. But the tank kept moving, kept clearing, kept creating a safe path. This might actually work, Mitchell said over the intercom. It has to work, his commander replied, because if it doesn't, we're all dead on the beach. The training intensified as D-Day approached. DD tank crews practiced launching in progressively rougher seas. Some tanks sank during training, the crews escaping, but the vehicles lost. Each failure was studied, modifications made, procedures refined. Aviary crews practiced firing their petards against concrete targets, learning the weapon's peculiar trajectory. The 40-pound bombs flew slowly enough that crews could actually watch them arc through the air before impact. Crocodile crews learned to handle the psychology of flame. Fire was a terror weapon, as much about breaking enemy morale as destroying positions. But it was also dangerous to the operator, requiring precise control. And through all of this, Hobart moved from unit to unit, inspecting, critiquing, encouraging. He was building not just specialized tanks, but specialized teams who understood that their strange vehicles were tools designed for specific jobs. You're not regular tankers, he told one assembled company. You're specialists, problem solvers. On D-Day, you'll face obstacles that would stop a conventional tank force. Your job is to make those obstacles disappear. June 1st, 1944. Final briefing. The invasion was days away, though the exact date remained classified. The 79th Armored Division's specialized units were dispersed among the assault forces. DD tanks assigned to swim ashore with the first wave, Averys to accompany engineers clearing beach obstacles, Crabs to open paths through minefields. Hobart stood before a room full of his commanders, looking at faces he'd come to know over 3 years of development and training. Everything we've built, everything we've trained for, comes down to a few hours on a beach, he said quietly. The Germans expect us. Rommel has prepared defenses specifically designed to defeat an amphibious assault. But he doesn't know about you. He gestured to the map, showing the Normandy beaches. He expects conventional tanks landing from conventional craft. He doesn't expect tanks that swim, tanks that clear mines while advancing, tanks that destroy bunkers with a single shot, tanks that create bridges and roadways on demand. Our advantage is surprise, not strategic surprise. They know we're coming, but tactical surprise. They won't know how to respond to equipment they've never seen before. Hobart paused, meeting eyes across the room. Some of you will die. Equipment will fail. Weather will be against us. Things will go wrong, because things always go wrong in war. But you'll have given our infantry the best possible chance to get off those beaches alive. That's all I ask. Do your jobs. Use your training. Make those funnies work, the men filed out, returning to their units for final preparations. Captain Ling found Hobart standing alone by the map, staring at the colored pins marking assault beaches. General, do you think we've done enough? Hobart was silent for a long moment. No, there's never enough preparation, enough equipment, enough time, but we've done what we could. He turned to face Ling. Now it's up to the men and their machines. And luck? And luck, Hobart agreed. Well, we'll need quite a bit of that. June 4th, 1944. Embarkation port, southern England. The harbor was a forest of gray steel. Landing craft packed so tightly that a man could walk from one end to the other without touching water. Rain drummed against metal hulls, and wind whipped spray across the decks where soldiers huddled under ponchos and tarps. Trooper David Mitchell sat in his Sherman crab, watching water stream down the vision port. Around him, the entire tank was buttoned up tight, engine silent, waiting. They'd been waiting for 2 days now, loaded aboard the landing craft ready to launch, and then held back by weather that made invasion impossible. Think they'll scrub it? Asked his gunner, Corporal James Parker, from his position in the turret. Can't scrub it forever, Mitchell replied. Every day we wait, Jerry gets stronger. In the cramped crew compartment, 5 men existed in a state of suspended tension. They'd said their goodbyes, written their letters home, prepared themselves mentally for battle. Now the waiting was worse than the fear. Through the hull, they could hear other crews moving about, voices muffled by steel and rain. Somewhere nearby, a DD tank crew was checking their flotation screens for the 100th time, making sure the canvas hadn't torn, that the inflation tubes held pressure. Mitchell thought about Dieppe, about tanks stuck on the beach, burning, about the screams of wounded men trapped in steel coffins, about how different it might have been if they'd had Hobart's Funnies 2 years ago. We're going to make it work this time, he said, not sure if he was reassuring Parker or himself. A few berths away, the AVRE crews faced their own anxieties. Lieutenant Peter Wells stood on the deck of his landing craft, rain soaking through his uniform, watching the gray waves that might drown them before they ever reached France. The AVRE was a massive vehicle, a Churchill tank modified with armor, equipment, and a petard mortar that made it even heavier than the standard model. Heavy tanks and rough seas were a dangerous combination. His loader, Private George Thompson, appeared at his elbow. Sir, the engineer lads are worried about the Fascine. Say it might shift in heavy weather. Wells looked back at their AVR. The massive bundle of logs, 6 feet in diameter and 11 feet long, was secured to the front of the tank. In theory, they'd drive up to an anti-tank ditch, drop the Fascine to fill it, and drive across. Simple. In practice, if the Fascine broke loose during transit, it could roll across the deck, crush men, or even sink the landing craft. Tell the engineers to add extra chains, Wells ordered. And make sure everyone stays clear of it if the seas get worse. Thompson nodded and disappeared into the rain. Wells remained on deck, watching the other ships. He could see Hobart's influence everywhere. Modified tanks painted with special unit markings, crews trained for specific tasks, equipment that defied conventional design. 3 years of work, all coming to a point on beaches they'd only seen in photographs and reconnaissance reports. Sir. His radio operator, Corporal Davies, poked his head out of the AVRE's commander's hatch. Signal from flagship, meeting at 2000 hours. All specialist armor commanders? Understood. Wells climbed back aboard his tank, grateful for the relative shelter. Inside, the crew had made a small space almost homey. Photographs taped to the armor, a deck of cards for endless games of poker, the smell of tea from a makeshift brewing station. We moving? Thompson asked hopefully. Meeting first? Then maybe, the crew groaned. More waiting. Always more waiting. 100 hours. Briefing room aboard HMS Bololo. The room was packed with officers from every specialized armor unit in the assault force. Hobart stood at the front with Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay and General Montgomery, all 3 men looking exhausted. Gentlemen, Ramsay began, the weather is improving. Supreme Commander Eisenhower has made the decision. D-Day is June 6th. H-hour is 0630 for the British and Canadian sectors. A murmur ran through the room. After days of waiting, the invasion was actually happening. Montgomery took over. First wave will consist of infantry and DD tanks. The DD tanks will launch 2 miles offshore and swim to the beach ahead of the landing craft. Your job is to provide covering fire the moment our infantry hits the sand. He pointed to the map of Gold Beach. Second wave includes the AVREs with fascines and bridges, the crabs for mine clearing, and additional conventional armor. Your objective is to neutralize the beach defenses and open routes inland within 30 minutes of landing. 30 minutes. Wells thought about everything that could go wrong in 30 minutes. Weather forecast shows improving conditions, Ramsay added. Seas will be choppy but manageable. Wind from the southwest at 15 knots. Not ideal, but acceptable, Hobart spoke for the first time. The DD tanks are the critical element. If they can reach the beach and suppress the coastal guns, everything else becomes possible. If they fail... He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood. A Royal Navy commander raised his hand. General Hobart, the Americans are choosing not to use the DD tanks at Omaha Beach. They'll launch their conventional Shermans closer to shore. I'm aware, Hobart said tightly. But surely if the specialized armor is so important, the Americans make their own decisions, Montgomery interrupted. We'll see whose approach proves more effective. Now, timing. The tide must be right to expose beach obstacles, but not so low that you have too much open sand under fire. Naval bombardment begins at 0550 hours. Air bombardment before that. You'll land in the wake of explosives and smoke. Wells listened as the briefing continued, covering every detail. Radio frequencies, recognition signals, contingency plans. But his mind was already on the beach, imagining his AVRE driving up to a German bunker, firing its petard, watching the flying dustbin arc through the air. Would it work as well under fire as it did in training? Or would they discover some fatal flaw only when bullets were flying and men were dying? June 5th, 1944, 1400 hours. Aboard landing craft. The word came down through the fleet. They were moving. Engines rumbled to life. Anchors were weighed. The Great Armada began its ponderous journey across the English Channel toward the coast of France. Mitchell sat in his crab, listening to the engine vibrate through the hull. Around him, his crew made final preparations, loading ammunition, checking the flail mechanism, testing the radio. "Driver, start your engine," came the order. Mitchell turned the key. The Sherman's engine roared to life, filling the enclosed space with noise and the smell of diesel. Through the vision port, he could see other landing craft moving in formation, creating lanes through the minefields that had been swept earlier. The channel was rough, but not impossible. The landing craft rolled with the waves, and Mitchell could feel his stomach lurching with each swell. Inside a buttoned-up tank, on a moving ship, in heavy seas, it was a special kind of misery. "If I throw up," Parker announced, "I'm aiming for the driver's position." "If you throw up, I'm aiming this entire tank at the nearest German bunker," Mitchell shot back. The banter helped. It kept them from thinking too hard about what was coming. Aboard the DD tank landing craft, the crews faced even greater anxiety. Sergeant William Harris stood beside his Sherman DD, watching the canvas flotation screen ripple in the wind. The screen was held up by rubber tubes inflated with compressed air, simple in concept, terrifyingly fragile in reality. "How long until we launch?" asked his gunner, Trooper Kevin O'Brien. 2 miles offshore," Harris replied. "Maybe 4 hours from now. And if the screen tears?" "We sink," O'Brien swallowed. "Right. Cheerful thought." But Harris was more worried about the propellers. The DD tank's propulsion system consisted of 2 small screws mounted at the rear, driven by the tank's tracks through a complicated series of gears. In calm water, they could push the 30-ton tank at about 4 miles per hour. In rough water, he'd seen DD tanks capsize during training. The crews had escaped, barely, but the tanks were lost. And that was in friendly waters with rescue boats standing by. If they capsized during the assault, in the dark, under fire, with hundreds of other vessels around them, "We'll make it," Harris said, again not sure who he was reassuring. "The Navy weathermen say the seas are calming." Through the gloom, he could see other DD tank landing craft, each carrying 4 swimming Shermans. 32 DD tanks total for Gold Beach. Their job was to hit the sand first, suppress the German guns, and give the infantry a chance. 32 tanks to break the Atlantic wall. It seemed insane. But then, everything about this invasion seemed insane. You couldn't think about the magnitude of it. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men, all converging on a few miles of fortified beach. You could only think about your job, your tank, your crew. Everything else was beyond comprehension. 800 hours. The light was fading. The fleet moved through gathering darkness, a city of ships sailing toward violence. Fighter aircraft roared overhead, heading for France. Bombers followed, waves of Lancasters and B-17s carrying tons of explosives meant to soften the beach defenses. In the landing craft, the specialized armor crews tried to rest. Some managed to doze, exhausted from days of tension. Others wrote letters they hoped wouldn't become their last words. A few played cards by flashlight, betting with francs they might never get to spend. Lieutenant Wells walked among his AVRE crews, checking on morale, answering questions, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Sir," one young trooper asked, "do you think the petard will actually work against real bunkers?" "It worked in training," Wells replied. "Broke through 2 feet of reinforced concrete. German bunkers are tough, but they're not invincible." "But what if?" "Then we'll figure something else out," Wells interrupted gently. "That's what we do. We solve problems. That's why we're here." The trooper nodded, but Wells could see the fear in his eyes. Hell, Wells felt the same fear. Every man on these ships did. The difference between courage and cowardice wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to function despite it. 200 hours. Full darkness now. The fleet moved through the night like ghosts, running lights extinguished, radio silence maintained. Below decks, men tried to sleep. In the tanks, crews huddled in cramped spaces, listening to the creak of metal and the sound of waves against the hull. Mitchell sat in his driver's seat, thinking about the flail chains wrapped around the drum on his tank's nose. 23 chains, each tipped with a steel weight. When spun at high speed, they would beat the ground hard enough to detonate mines. In theory, he'd done it dozens of times in training. But training mines were marked. You knew where they were. On the beach, mines would be everywhere, buried in sand, hidden under obstacles, waiting to turn tanks into coffins. Mitchell? Parker's voice came through the darkness. Yeah? When we hit the beach. If something happens to me, tell my sister. Nothing's going to happen to you, Mitchell interrupted. But if it does, then I'll tell her myself, Mitchell promised. But it won't come to that. We're going to roll up that beach, clear the mines, and be drinking French wine by tomorrow night. French wine tastes like vinegar. Then we'll complain about it together. Parker laughed, a short bark of sound in the darkness. Deal. Midnight. June 6th, 1944, D-Day had begun. The fleet moved through darkness toward the coast of France. Somewhere ahead, German radar operators were tracking them. Somewhere ahead, German soldiers were manning bunkers and machine gun nests, preparing to defend their stretch of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And somewhere in that great armada, aboard landing craft and command ships, Percy Hobart watched his funnies move toward their destiny. He'd done everything he could. Designed the tanks, trained the crews, fought the skeptics, proved the concepts worked in training. Now came the test that mattered. Combat against an enemy who wouldn't cooperate, on beaches that wouldn't behave like training grounds, in conditions that couldn't be perfectly predicted. His strange tanks, his swimming Shermans, his flailing crabs, his mortar-armed AVREs would either vindicate 3 years of work or prove the skeptics right. By tomorrow evening, everyone would know. Hobart stood on the deck of his command ship, watching the dark water, and allowed himself one prayer, that his funnies would save more lives than they cost, that his crazy ideas would prove wise, that the men he'd trained would survive to see France liberated. The wind carried spray across the deck, cold and salt-tasting. Ahead, invisible in the darkness, lay the coast of Normandy. June 6th, 1944, 05:30 hours, 2 miles off Gold Beach. The sky erupted in fire. Mitchell felt the concussion through his tank's hull, a deep, rolling thunder that made the landing craft shudder. Through the vision port, he could see the horizon light up as hundreds of naval guns opened fire simultaneously. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Every gun that could reach the beach was hammering the German positions. Shells screamed overhead, streaks of light against the gray dawn. The beach ahead was invisible behind a wall of explosions and smoke. Geysers of sand and concrete erupted where bunkers had stood moments before. Christ, Parker breathed. There won't be anything left. Mitchell hoped he was right. But he'd seen naval bombardments before. They looked devastating from a distance, but men in concrete bunkers could survive almost anything. The Germans would be waiting. All DD tanks prepare to launch, crackled through the radio. Mitchell's heart hammered. This was it, the moment all the training had led to. Around them, the landing craft's ramp mechanism groaned. The vessel turned to face the beach, wallowing in the swells. Through the vision port, Mitchell could see gray water and darker gray sky. No horizon, just endless wetness. Inflate flotation screens, came the order. Harris's crew scrambled into action. Compressed air hissed into the rubber tubes that supported the canvas screens. Slowly, the fabric walls rose around the Sherman, transforming it from a tank into something that vaguely resembled a boat. Screen inflated and secure, Harris reported over the radio. All tanks, engine check. Mitchell revved his engine. The familiar roar was reassuring, at least something was working as planned. DD tanks, launch. 0:45 hours. The ramp splashed down and Harris felt his stomach drop. Through the canvas screen, he could see waves, 3-foot swells that looked mountainous from inside a tank. Driver, forward slow. The Sherman crept down the ramp. The front edge touched water. Then the flotation screen took the weight. And suddenly they were floating. 30 tons of steel and explosives bobbing like a cork. Propellers engaged, Harris ordered. The tank's tracks engaged the propeller drive system. The 2 small screws at the rear began to churn, pushing them forward at an agonizing crawl. Through the canvas, Harris could see other DD tanks entering the water, dark shapes wallowing in the waves. One tank's screen collapsed immediately. The Sherman tilted, water pouring over the front deck, and vanished beneath the surface in seconds. Harris didn't see any crew escape. Keep the nose up, Harris barked at his driver. Trim tanks balanced. We're not swimming to France, we're crawling. The waves hit them broadside. Each swell lifted the tank, tilted it at terrifying angles, then dropped it into a trough. Water sloshed over the canvas screen. The propellers screamed as they left the water, then bit again as the tank settled. Inside the canvas walls, Harris's crew existed in a twilight world, hearing the naval bombardment continue, feeling the waves toss them, seeing nothing but gray canvas and gray water. Range to beach? Harris asked his gunner, O'Brien, who was trying to navigate by compass. 1,500 yards. Maybe. 1,500 yards. 3/4 of a mile. At 4 miles per hour, assuming they could maintain speed in these seas, that meant Harris did the math. 20 minutes of this nightmare. Another DD tank capsized 100 yards away. Harris watched helplessly as the crew tried to escape through the hatches, but the tank rolled too fast. It sank stern first, taking 4 men with it. Keep swimming, Harris whispered. Just keep swimming. 5 hours. 1 mile offshore. Mitchell's landing craft moved through the growing chaos. All around them, the invasion fleet was launching its assault. Infantry landing craft plowed toward the beach in waves. Landing ships disgorged amphibious trucks. Rocket barges fired salvos that screamed overhead like freight trains. And among them all, the DD tanks struggled through the swells, ungainly, vulnerable, but moving. 10 minutes to beach, announced the landing craft commander over the loudspeaker. Mitchell watched a DD tank through his vision port. The swimming Sherman was making progress, but barely. Each wave threatened to swamp it. How many were still afloat? How many had already sunk? Behind his crab, other specialized armor waited. AVREs loaded with bridges and fascines, more crabs for mine clearing, conventional Shermans for direct fire support. But they were all depending on the DD tanks to arrive first and suppress the beach defenses. If the DD tanks failed, everything else would fail too. Well, 6.5 hours, 200 yards offshore. Sergeant Harris could see the beach now through gaps in the canvas screen. It looked nothing like the reconnaissance photos. The naval bombardment had transformed it into a moonscape of craters and debris, but the bunkers were still there. He could see them, concrete structures emerging from the smoke, firing slits dark against the gray walls. And as he watched, muzzle flashes sparkled from those slits. They were shooting at the DD tanks. Machine gun bullets punched through the canvas screen, tearing ragged holes. Water began to pour in through the tiers, screens compromised. O'Brien yelled, "Keep going," Harris ordered. "We're almost there." The beach was 100 yards away now, so close. But the canvas screen was shredding under the fire. More water poured in. The tank began to settle lower in the water. "We're taking on water fast," the driver reported, panic edging into his voice. 50 yards? Just give me 50 more yards." The Sherman wallowed through the surf. Canvas screen half collapsed, water pouring over the decks. Harris could see the seafloor now through the murky water. They were in the shallows. "Drop the screen," he ordered. The crew hit the release mechanisms. The canvas screen collapsed, and suddenly they were a tank again instead of a drowning boat. The tracks bit into sand, and they lurched forward onto the beach. "We made it," O'Brien breathed. "Jesus Christ, we made it." But there was no time for celebration. German machine guns were already traversing toward them. Harris swung the turret toward the nearest bunker, acquiring the target through his sights. Gunner, target bunker, he round. Identified. Fire. The 75mm gun roared. The high explosive shell struck the bunker's firing slit, detonating inside. The machine gun fell silent. Around them, other DD tanks were emerging from the surf, wet, battered, but functional. They fanned out across the beach, engaging targets, providing the covering fire the plan called for. But Harris counted only 18 tanks on the beach. 32 had launched. 14 were lost, sunk in the crossing, crews drowned or dying in the cold channel water. Still, 18 tanks were infinitely better than none, and they were already making a difference. 6.25 hours. Hour minus 5 minutes. The first infantry landing craft hit the beach. Ramps dropped, and men poured out into knee-deep water, running for cover. German fire swept the beach. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. Men fell, but others kept coming. Wave after wave. But unlike Omaha Beach to the west, where American forces were landing without swimming tanks, without specialized armor, without Hobart's Funnies, Gold Beach had covering fire from the moment the first boot touched sand. The DD tanks engaged bunkers. Suppressed machine gun nests provided mobile cover for advancing infantry. They couldn't eliminate all the German fire, but they broke up the kill zones, created gaps, gave the infantry chances. Private Thomas Green, 6th Battalion Green Howards, hit the beach at a dead run. Bullets kicked up sand around him. Men to his left and right fell. But ahead of him, a Sherman tank was hammering a German position, keeping the enemy's heads down. Green dove behind the tank, using it as cover. The tank's engine roared, and it began to move forward. Green ran with it, staying in the shelter of its bulk, and made it to the seawall, 50 yards inland, a concrete barrier that marked the edge of the beach proper. He was alive. He was off the beach, and he owed it to a swimming tank that had looked ridiculous in training photos but had just saved his life. 630 hours. Eichauer, Mitchell's landing craft, grounded on the beach. The ramp splashed down, and suddenly they could see the battle. Smoke, fire, running men, burning vehicles, explosions, throwing sand and debris into the air. "Crab tanks, deploy," came the order. Mitchell gunned his engine. The Sherman lurched down the ramp, tracks biting sand, and they were on the beach. Around them, the battle raged, but his job wasn't to fight. His job was to clear a path. "Engage flail," Mitchell ordered. The drum on the front of the tank began to spin. The chains whirled, becoming a blur of motion. They struck the sand with tremendous force, beating the ground. Boom! A mine detonated under the flail, the explosion throwing sand and shrapnel skyward. The blast rocked the tank but caused no damage. The chains had detonated the mine several feet ahead of the hull. Boom! Another mine. And another. Mitchell drove forward at steady 5 miles per hour. the flail clearing a path exactly 10 feet wide. Behind him, infantry followed in the cleared lane, staying carefully within the marks his tracks left. Mine density is heavy, Parker reported. Detonating every few yards. Keep counting, Mitchell replied. I need to know when we're through the field. More explosions. The noise was tremendous. The roar of the engine, the clatter of chains, the constant concussion of mines detonating. Mitchell's world narrowed to the strip of sand ahead of him, the marks he was leaving, the path he was creating. To his right, another crab was doing the same thing. To his left, a third. They advanced in line, beating the ground, clearing 3 parallel lanes through the minefield. Infantry followed in their wake, safe lanes through what had been an impassable barrier. Engineers followed too, marking the lanes with tape and stakes so that follow-on forces would know where to go. In 15 minutes, Mitchell's crab cleared a 200-yard path through the densest minefield on Gold Beach. Mines that would have killed dozens of men. Stopped tanks, stalled the entire assault, neutralized by whirling chains. That's it, Parker announced. No more detonations. We're through. Mitchell shut down the flail mechanism and took his first real look at the beach around him. The infantry was advancing inland. More landing craft were hitting the shore. The specialized armor was everywhere. AVREs engaging bunkers with their petards, tanks towing fascines toward anti-tank ditches, even a crocodile unleashing a stream of flame toward a German strongpoint. Hobart's Funnies were working. 4 or 5 hours. Lieutenant. Wells brought his Aver up to an anti-tank ditch, a massive excavation cutting across the beach, 20 feet wide and 12 feet deep. It would stop any conventional tank. But Wells wasn't driving a conventional tank. Drop fashion, he ordered. The release mechanism fired. The massive bundle of logs rolled forward off the tank's nose and tumbled into the ditch. It didn't completely fill the excavation, but it created a bridge, a platform of wood that would support a tank's weight. Wells drove forward, carefully positioning his tracks on the fascine. The AVRE's weight compressed the logs, but they held. He drove across the ditch and emerged on the far side. Fascine deployed successfully, he reported over the radio. Ditch is passable. Behind him, other tanks followed across the bridge his AVRE had created. An obstacle that should have stopped the entire assault had been neutralized in 2 minutes. Wells looked for his next target, a concrete bunker still firing at the beach from an elevated position. The structure looked impervious, its walls thick enough to shrug off naval shells. But Wells had the petard. Gunner, target bunker, range 80 yards. Identified. Fire. The petard mortar coughed. The 40-pound flying dustbin bomb flew in its characteristic lazy arc. Wells watched it tumble through the air. You could actually see the projectile in flight. So slow was its velocity. The bomb struck the bunker's front wall and detonated. The explosion was massive, far larger than a conventional tank round. When the smoke cleared, the bunker's front wall had been blown inward. The firing slit was a gaping hole. No more fire came from that position. Target destroyed, Wells reported. His voice was steady, but his hands shook on the controls. He'd just killed men, probably a dozen German soldiers in that bunker. It was necessary. It saved British lives, but it still felt heavy. Havre units, advance inland, came the order. Clear the beach obstacles. Wells drove forward, looking for the next problem that needed solving. 700 hours. On Gold Beach, the assault was succeeding. Not easily. Men were still dying, vehicles still burning, the Germans still fighting, but succeeding. The DD tanks had provided crucial covering fire in the first minutes. The crabs had cleared paths through minefields. The AVREs had neutralized bunkers and bridged ditches. The crocodiles had driven defenders from fortified positions with flame. Every type of specialized armor was performing its designed function, and together they were breaking through defenses that should have been impregnable. 3 miles to the west, on Omaha Beach, the story was different. American forces, landing without swimming tanks, without mine-clearing armor, without specialized assault vehicles, were pinned down on the beach, suffering catastrophic casualties. The defenses there were no stronger than Gold Beach, but the attackers lacked the tools to overcome them quickly. By noon, British and Canadian forces would be several miles inland. American forces at Omaha would still be fighting to get off the beach. The difference wasn't courage or training, it was equipment. It was Hobart's Funnies. 0730 hours. Gold Beach. The beach was chaos, but controlled chaos. Smoke drifted across churned sand. Burned-out vehicles smoldered. Medics moved among the wounded. But the assault was inland now, infantry and armor pushing through the beach defenses into the villages beyond. Hobart stood aboard his command ship. Binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching his Funnies at work. A crab thrashed through another minefield. An AVRE fired its petard at a strong point. DD tanks provided covering fire as infantry advanced. Gold Beach reports breaches in all sectors, an officer reported. Casualties moderate. Advance proceeding ahead of schedule. Hobart lowered his binoculars. Moderate casualties. Not light. Men had died, were still dying, but moderate. Compared to what it could have been, what it would have been without specialized armor, it was a miracle. In Omaha? he asked quietly. The officer's face darkened. Heavy casualties. Very heavy. They're pinned down, Hobart nodded grimly. The Americans had rejected most of his designs. They'd land their tanks conventionally, from close range, under fire. The report suggested they were paying for that decision in blood. He felt no satisfaction in being right. Only sorrow for the men dying unnecessarily. 100 hours. Inland from Gold Beach. Mitchell's crab rumbled through a narrow French lane, hedgerows pressing close on both sides. They'd cleared the beach, cleared 3 minefields, and now were advancing with the infantry toward the first objectives inland. Village ahead, Parker called. Looks quiet, too quiet. Mitchell slowed, every sense alert. This was bocage country, perfect for ambush. A German anti-tank gun opened fire from a hidden position. The shell struck the crab's front armor, deflecting off the flail mechanism. The chains absorbed most of the impact. Target left. Mitchell shouted, reversing hard. Parker traversed the turret and fired. The German position exploded. Infantry rushed forward to secure it. The flail saved us, Parker said, his voice shaking. Oh, that shell hit the chains. Mitchell looked at the twisted metal where one chain had been sheared off. The flail mechanism was damaged, but functional. More importantly, the crew was alive. Hobart's crazy design had just saved their lives in a way no one had predicted. 100 hours. British headquarters. Montgomery reviewed the morning's reports with satisfaction. All 5 beaches were secured. British and Canadian forces were pushing inland. The landings, risky, bloody, but ultimately successful, had worked. The specialized armor made the difference, reported one of his staff officers. Casualty rates on Gold and Sword beaches, where the Funnies deployed, were significantly lower than on beaches where they weren't used. Montgomery glanced at the reports from Omaha. Beach. American forces were still struggling there, suffering appalling losses. It would take heroism and sacrifice to break that deadlock, heroism that might not have been necessary with different equipment. Send my compliments to General Hobart, Montgomery said. His Funnies have proven their worth. June 7th, 1944. Dawn. Sergeant Harris sat on his D-Day tank, watching the sunrise over France. They'd made it. His crew had survived D-Day. The swimming tank that looked so absurd had carried them through the surf, onto the beach, and into history. Around him, the remnants of the D-Day tank squadron gathered, 18 tanks from the 32 that launched. 14 crews were gone, drowned in the Channel crossing, but those 18 tanks had made the difference between success and slaughter for the thousands of infantry who landed after them. Worth it? O'Brien asked quietly. Harris thought about the men who'd drowned, about the terror of that crossing, about the bullets punching through the canvas screen. Yeah, he said finally. It was worth it. July 1944. England. Percy Hobart received orders to return to England for debriefing. As his staff car drove through the summer countryside, he reflected on 3 years of work. The skepticism, the setbacks, the vindication. His Funnies had worked. Not perfectly. Equipment failed, men died. Some designs proved less effective than hoped. But they'd worked well enough to save thousands of lives. The Americans were now requesting specialized armor. Montgomery was demanding more AVREs, more crabs, more of everything. The funny tanks weren't funny anymore. They were essential. At the War Office, a general who'd once called Hobart's designs impractical now greeted him warmly. Brilliant work, Hobart. Absolutely brilliant. Hobart accepted the praise with grace, but his thoughts were elsewhere. On the crews still fighting in France. On the designs that still needed refinement. On the next problem that needed solving. We're not done yet, he said. Berlin's a long way from Normandy. The legacy, by war's end, Hobart's Funnies would participate in every major British operation. They'd cross rivers, breach fortifications, clear paths through devastated cities. They'd prove that unconventional thinking could solve conventional problems. The D-Day tanks would swim across the Rhine. The AVREs would demolish German strongpoints throughout France and Germany. The crabs would clear mines from Holland to Hamburg. And decades later, when historians studied D-Day, they would point to the specialized armor as a key factor in the invasion's success. The crazy ideas of one stubborn engineer had helped win the war. Hobart retired in 1946, knighted and decorated. He lived quietly, rarely giving interviews, never seeking glory. When asked about his greatest achievement, he said simply, "I gave the men tools to do their jobs." They did the rest. He died in 1957, largely forgotten by the public. But the tank crews who'd driven his Funnies, the men who'd survived because of swimming tanks and mine flails and bridge layers, they remembered. At his funeral, a small group of veterans stood in the rain. Among them was Mitchell, Harris, and Wells, men who'd tested the impossible and found it worked. He saved our lives, Mitchell said quietly. He saved thousands of lives, Harris corrected. They stood in silence, remembering the eccentric engineer who'd refused to accept that problems couldn't be solved, who'd turned crazy ideas into steel reality, who'd proven that sometimes the most unconventional answer is the right one. The man they'd once called mad had been the sanest person in the room all along.